Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Solutions podcast. And today I am here with the wonderful Ian Redmond. And I saw a really great little summary of when you were asked, Ian, about yourself. And it says that I'm a naturalist by birth, a biologist by training, and a conservationist by necessity. And I hear you. I think that's absolutely, we are in a place of necessity where all of us have to act. And, you know, you've had a life of acting. So thank you so much for coming along. And
my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So just to, who is Ian, for those of you that don't know, maybe you'd like to just give a quick little intro to who are you? What's your,
you just give my intro.
I have given, I've given your summary. But what would you say is your elevator pitch?
I take the stairs. Let's talk as we walk upstairs.
So as you can see, I think it gives it away a little bit, the fact that your office has gorillas in the background. So I think that
yes.
that might be one big hint that you must have something to do with gorillas and maybe elephants too.
Yes, elephants and gorillas both feature large in my life, as they do in a largely unappreciated way in everyone's life. So because we're such an anthropocentric species, we only care about things if they matter to us. And of course, on a personal level, having had the good fortune to study and get to know and be trusted by, it's an important addition, gorillas and elephants living in their natural habitat, going about their daily business. And I, for a time, just became a feature of their natural habitat, but one that didn't terrify them. And usually wild animals, when they see a human, they fear that any contact with humans will result in death or captivity, or something bad will happen, so they run away. And only where they start to trust people will they think, oh, there's a human, but I'm eating, so I'll carry on eating, rather than run. Or
it must be
still, if you're so close that it's I better defend myself because this human's going to get me, then someone gets hurt. And it's sometimes the human, but more often it's the animal, because humans have projectiles. You know, if it's hand-to-hand combat, most humans are going to fail when it comes to any large animal. But we have projectiles. We can disable or even kill our opponent before we even make contact with them physically. And the technical term is habituation. If you habituate an animal to a harmless human presence, then you can get to observe them. And where that happens in a place where the animals are not threatened, absolutely fine. It's wonderful for all, I think, for all concerned, because once they don't have fear of humans, wild animals, particularly the more intelligent ones, are curious about humans. And they must
see the similarity as well. Yeah.
Well, I think that certainly with the great apes that they do, but oddly, in a sort of cognitive way, even with elephants, they seem to recognize that humans are different from other animals, and when it's in a positive relationship, there is a lot of mutual interest.
It must be such an honor, though, when they do trust you, and that look in their eyes when they see you as a friend. And it takes a while.
Wonderful. In the sense of generating wonder, wonderful in the sense of generating wonder. A connection there. And that connection with a lot of animals is through eye contact.
Yeah.
And that connecting eye to eye without fear is the basis of any trust. You know, how do I get you to trust me? I look you in the eye and say something, and unless I'm a very good actor, and you have to watch out for those, then I mean what I say.
And what about the young? What about the young? I mean, have you had any moments where, you know, even more so, I mean, it's a thing one-on-one with an adult animal, but for them to trust you with their young and being around their young, I mean, that's a whole other level, isn't it?
Yes. So just for the purposes of illustration, let me use the magic of virtual backgrounds to change from my office, and let's just hop over to the Virunga volcanoes for a moment. Here we are. So this is just a little bit of a day rest period of a group of gorillas that I was taking some journalists to see. They actually wanted to do a story of what happened to the gorillas who met David Attenborough. Because I happened to be in the right place at the right time when David Attenborough, in January 1978, came to Rwanda, to the Virunga volcanoes, to the Volcanoes National Park, at the invitation of Dianne Fossey, to film the mountain gorillas. Not to tell the story of Diane's research or all about gorillas. No, this was part of the Life on Earth series, which was the first of the big blue chip natural history documentary series that David Attenborough presented. And he just wanted a short sequence to talk about the opposable thumb. And his producer, John Sparks, said, well, instead of going to a species that we've seen filmed before, let's go. He'd heard about this American woman who was studying gorillas. And so the BBC turned up with a film crew, as not then Sir David, it was just David then, to film a sequence about how the use of an opposing thumb gives you a precise grip, and how important that is in evolutionary terms, and certainly in our own evolution. And no one reckoned with the film crew being so accepted by the gorillas that the gorillas would interact in a physical way with Sir David. So the group behind me is actually led by the son of Pablo, who was the gorilla who sat on David Attenborough. And it's still known as the Pablo group, because and I used to say, well, some of my best friends are gorillas, but my best friend gorillas have all died of natural causes because their lifespan is a bit shorter than mine. I'm happy to say I'm still here, but Pablo and Titus and the gorillas who I watched in their infancy and early years, and who interacted with David Attenborough for that very short sequence in the Life in the Trees program of Life on Earth. Anyway, yes, so this behind me was filmed 40 years after Life on Earth, when the Mirror wanted to do a piece on whatever happened to the gorillas who met David Attenborough.
And there they are, the descendants.
Really nice, well, those are the children and grandchildren of the gorillas who met David Attenborough. And
I think that's a really important point to talk about children and grandchildren, because seeing that continuity, and so often in our anthropocentric worldview, it's all about humans and our children, and we forget that all other life have these descendants and this right to life and this right to continuity. And when you have that relationship, and hearing you before talking about you're being able to work with Dianne, and then the absolute shock of being around when end of life was brought too short, and that overwhelming grief and sadness that when another life, a friend of ours, has been murdered, whether we talk about murdering really only to humans, but moving that to say, well, actually we can murder all other life forms, and then how does that make us feel? So many people are totally disconnected from having a relationship with other species. And, they have that with their domesticated animals. If somebody killed their dog or cat, there would be uproar. But we don't have that same feeling with, other wildlife, especially something which is, on the other side of the world, and we don't feel directly connected to it. So maybe you could explain a little how are we all connected to these great species? And that whole anthropocentric question, well, what do they do for us? Why is it important?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because if you're a naturalist in the UK and you look out of your window, I'm looking out over Stroud in Gloucestershire, And in the valley, you see swifts and swallows hunting insects on the wing. And a few weeks ago, those swifts and swallows were feeding up, ready for their journey north across the Sahara, in the forests where gorillas and chimpanzees and elephants live. So if you're a naturalist and you see those connections, and migratory birds are particularly good at linking, certainly Europe and Africa and the northern hemisphere with the southern hemisphere around the world, there's a very direct, the energy they gain from eating insects whose larval stages are feeding on food plants that may be seed dispersed by gorillas, or more likely by elephants. Elephants disperse more seeds, a greater number of seeds of more species, a greater distance than any other animal. And gorillas are about second to them. And they also help by building nests and creating the conditions where germinating seeds in the dung of the gorilla are in the right place, because there's a nice light gap created by the gorillas building their nests. And that, so this swallow that I'm watching through my binoculars on my weekend off in the sunshine over England or Wales or Scotland, and in Scotland you've got corn crakes, and the really interesting research, putting little geolocators on the legs of chicks, and then when you download the data, you find exactly where they've been. And that they not only go to West Africa, they go down to Central Africa and sometimes South Africa. I was once helping Gordon Buchanan make a documentary called The Gorilla Family and Me in Kahuzi-Biega National Park. And the park headquarters has a very dodgy internet link. And I downloaded some stuff, and there was a notice of a paper published about the swifts that nest in the Imperial Palace in Beijing. And with the help of these little geolocators, they had tracked their journey over the top of Kahuzi-Biega National Park to South Africa and then back again. And yet to the Chinese people, the return of the swifts in spring is a really important cultural moment. It's the end of winter, spring is here, summer's coming, and the swifts are back. And I think migratory birds play that role for a lot of people. The first cuckoo, people write to the Times saying, I've heard the first cuckoo. And the cuckoos have spent the winter rubbing shoulders, metaphorically and almost literally, with African animals. And therefore, it's no good conserving cuckoo habitat or putting up swift boxes on the side of your house, which is a great thing to do, given how most houses now don't have places where swifts can get into. So you have to kind of create holes in the roof, swift boxes, so that they have somewhere to nest. But they're not going to nest there if they don't come back from Africa. And they're not going to come back from Africa if their habitat in Africa is not protected. So that's kind of joined up conservation. But there's an even more direct personal dependency that we all have on the species that are, I like to use the hashtag gardeners of the forest. So the gorillas and chimpanzees and forest elephants in Africa, the Asian elephants and orangutans and gibbons and other primates in South and Southeast Asia, in Amazonia, as you know only too well, tapirs and toucans and muriquis and spider monkeys, and all those species are playing a role in gardening the forest, pruning the trees as they break off food plants to eat, eating the fruit and then swallowing the seeds and dispersing them somewhere else. And the nutrients in the dung, which become the foundation for the seedlings, which might get eaten by a forest floor animal, or they might grow into a mighty forest giant in several hundred years' time. Those ecosystems, as many people realize more now, are not only providing oxygen for us to breathe. They reckon that every other breath we have to thank the phytoplankton in the oceans, and the other breath is the photosynthesis in trees and other plants on land. Well, those plants are there because someone ate a fruit and pooped a seed. And if that someone is like the gorillas behind me, then that's a direct benefit that everyone is getting from the fresh air that we breathe. But trees don't just generate oxygen, they take in and store carbon in the wood, and we need less CO2 and in the atmosphere if we're going to stabilize our climate. So trees play multiple roles. They also provide the rainfall. And here in the UK, we're saying, oh, we need to use more renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. Sure, yes. One of those is hydropower. Hydropower depends on rain. You track the rainfall in the UK back across the Atlantic to the Amazon rainforest, and then even further, there are weather systems going back to the Congo Basin. So these gorillas are pooping seeds that will grow into trees that will, through evapotranspiration, put water vapor into the atmosphere. Some of it will fall locally because of the volatile organic compounds that the trees put out that generate rain there. But it builds up weather systems that you can track around the globe, and they fill the aquifers and power the hydropower in Scotland. And yet when you pay your bill to Scottish Hydropower, not one penny goes to fund the protection of the ecosystems that are putting the water vapor into the atmosphere that falls as rain in Scotland.
Those that actually planted the trees freely, those, and I think that we talk about tree planting as if it's a human thing, that we go out and we plant these trees, without exactly what you're saying. It's like these species that is just naturally what they do. They are just naturally tree planting without the need of a spade and fertilizing it at the same time.
Unexpected species like foxes. Foxes eat plums. I've got the camera trap video of them in my orchard eating plums on a fallen branch, and they're swallowing them, and then the seed pokes out. Badgers certainly are important seed dispersal agents, and yet because of a misguided idea about the link between badgers and bovine tuberculosis, there has been this extermination of badgers across many parts of the UK. Reducing their population, and people are saying, oh, the poor badgers are being killed. Of course, that is I think it's a misguided policy, needs to change. But think about how many countless thousands of seeds are not being dispersed by the badgers who are now dead.
Yeah.
And whatever species you're looking at, if they're involved in some ecosystem processes, if their numbers have been reduced, as we know, overall by 2/3, some species by 90-something%, some species by less, but there are fewer animals in the wild today, more and more cattle and sheep and goats, and many of them being kept in feed indoors in big commercial agricultural facilities, which depend on crops grown on land which used to be natural habitat. So we've changed all these natural ecosystems that worked in harmony with each other into industrial agriculture, plantation, farming, use of pesticides and other chemical fertilizers based on converting fossil fuels, oil, into fertilizers. We're completely unhinging these natural processes to a point now where we're talking about global crises. Yeah. The loss of biodiversity, not just a shame because there's some interesting species that are going extinct, but ecosystem collapse is being predicted if we don't turn that around. And a part of that is the inability for the planet to stabilize the climate as a result of the actions of humans digging up and burning fossil fuels. And we're asking more and more of an ecosystem, whilst at the same time reducing it to a fraction of its former state. And where the ecosystem does exist, the number of animals has been reduced. So it's like if you've got a factory that normally employs 1,000 people and you reduce the workforce by 950, and 95% is the percentage reduction in elephants across most of their range, and in apes across most of their range, we're killing off the workers in the factory of life. And that is very worrying.
And I think a lot of people just don't understand what they do. Like we're simplifying it, but yes, they're planting trees. But I remember when we were both, obviously we both first met through our relationship with Polly Higgins, dear Polly, yes. And we did something for the Ecocide Earth Protectors. But we then went on to be working with Rebalance Earth. And I was fascinated to learn then about the difference with forest and how an elephant can be seen to be sequestering so much carbon. And when they made the comparison between some forest with, an intact ecosystem with forest elephants and another forest where the elephants had been poached out, that they can actually scientifically record that the trees where the elephants are sequestering so much more carbon because they are the gardeners, they're thinning it out, the trees get bigger, and therefore they can calculate the difference between the carbon that's in a forest which has elephants in. So, that was new news for me. And I think for many people, when I've explained it to them, they're like, wow, God, I would never have thought that. So there's a part of it where, yes, we need the education to understand what are we doing. We are recklessly just destroying the planet without even realizing what we're doing. And, we've both, been so lucky to spend time in some key biodiversity areas. And, seeing when, oh, look, we've got, hello, Ellie.
We're going to talk about forest elephants.
Talking about Ellie. And so spending time, where I got locked down in Los Cedros, where there are still so many species that have yet to be named, they've yet to be identified.
Yeah.
So we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what these threads in the tapestry are of, how it all connects together. And we're just starting to, talk about it more and more. Everything's connected. And yes, it really is. And you pull one string and it all unravels. And so, when we talk about, well, why is conservation important? And, what can we do? At the moment, there's a big talk about tree planting, which drives me absolutely crazy, the talk of tree planting, because I feel, and I've said this many times, that as we're talking right now, Ian, somewhere there's, thousands of little saplings being planted. And right now, in this very same moment, thousands of ancient trees are also being cut down. So we really need to kind of prioritize first saving the trees that are already established. And then if we do tree plant or not, just allowing it to naturally recover around already established forests. But there doesn't seem to be this joined up thinking. It's like, right, we're just going to go and plant, 10,000 trees there in the middle of an empty field, rather than allowing.
That's the unintended consequence of perverse incentives. You want to incentivize people to plant trees, and if the grant is for planting trees, where are you going to put them? Oh, we'll have to clear that forest over there in order to plant the trees to get the grant.
In the Amazon, they've told me that they've actually got money to plant teak as carbon offset, and they have cut down the rainforest and then planted a totally non-native species and then got paid for it. This is how crazy it is right now. We've got another, on that same thread of forest going down. Recently, about a couple of months ago, a friend from the Amazon, she sent me this new images of large-scale deforestation. And I asked her what it was for, and she said it was for taro root. That's T-A-R-O, taro. And I said, well, why are they growing so much taro? And she said, well, it's all being exported to Europe and America. So I thought, I asked around and nobody knew why we were importing all this taro. I put it out on Twitter. I asked, does anybody know what we're suddenly importing all this taro from? And I found somebody sent me a research paper. It's the vegan plant-based diet. So we think on one side that, yes, palm oil is the big threat. We need to all go vegan. We need to save the forests, without realizing that if we're eating processed food and not knowing where it's coming from, we are still causing massive deforestation because we're just not able to join the dots up. So, there are so many drivers to forest destruction. And, one of the solutions that I know also you have been working with is this virtual tourism. So, many people say, oh, well, one of the solutions for the people down there is tourism. And, I hear it all the time in the Amazon. We need to build another lodge, more tourists. And I always advise against it, because, you know, it's one of those bubbles that, like COVID, when it bursts, all of a sudden, hopefully, when there is a tax in aviation, there won't be cheap flights anymore. So all those cheap gap year students are not going to be all flying down to South America. So if they build an industry on, you know, cheap flights, what happens when actually there isn't, you know, people aren't still flying? And it's the same in Africa. So we've got the massive carbon footprint of tourism. And then, you know, there are other impacts. So speak a little bit about your experience there with tourism and the effects of it.
Well, my experience with tourism is largely positive.
Yeah.
In the sense that I usually every year, although I haven't for a couple of years because of COVID, take small special interest tours to see how the gorillas or elephants or other species. And these are usually fellow naturalists who want to learn about the species. And for mountain gorillas in particular, the concept of low volume, high cost tourism has proved very successful in both Rwanda and Uganda, and when it's safe on the other side of the border in the Congo. Communities have benefited, revenues have come in that have funded the protection of the gorillas and their habitat and the forests. So it's been a largely positive experience, but the number of people who can visit a family of gorillas each day is 8. It used to be 6, but they put it up to 8 with some controversy. But more than that, it's difficult to keep everything calm. And what you want when you're visiting gorillas is for no one to get upset. You don't want the people to get upset, and you don't want the gorillas to get upset. Otherwise, the contact doesn't have the same quality or people value it, as you were seeing in that video before. They're just peaceful gorillas accepting of human visitors. But it is always a slight conundrum that to get to Central Africa, you have to fly, because no one's got time to travel overland these days. Maybe if flights became more expensive, the gap year students would go and hitchhike, as I did. Hitchhiking is a great way to get around, and you learn so much more. But maybe the commercial incentive to come up with hydrogen fuel cell powered aircraft or some form of flight that doesn't damage the climate will be the solution there. But tourism is, as you say, a very fragile thing to base your conservation on, because if there's a civil war or a terrorist outrage, and the terrorist outrage doesn't have to be near the destination, this has to be on the same continent. You know, something horrible happens in Africa, in some part of Africa, and people don't go to any one of the 54 countries in Africa because it's in Africa. Never mind that it's thousands of miles from the terrorism. Many tourists are risk averse. So something bad happens, tourism stops. And we now have the example of a global pandemic, which resulted in governments imposing travel restrictions and shutting the world down. And many conservation projects that depended on tourist revenues found it very difficult to continue and had to revert to philanthropy. So what is needed is an income stream that isn't dependent on tourism. I think tourism has a role to play, but probably a smaller role than some people would wish. And mass tourism can be very destructive. So small groups of thoughtful people learning about another culture or another species, I'm all for it. Thousands of people building huge hotels, everyone wanting a hot shower every morning and air conditioning it all day when it gets too hot. No.
I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, you know, I totally hear you. And I absolutely have also, you know, seen there's benefits and negatives of everything almost. But with the tourism, it's like when we're saying, well, only a few people could go, then we open it up to, oh, well, that means that only the rich are ever going to be able to afford to go and actually have the experience in real life. And then, you know, the masses are not going to be able to afford it. So, you know, there's always this dilemma.
Well, there used to be a concept where people who really wanted something a lot but didn't have much money, they saved up.
Yes.
Sometimes over several years to achieve their goal.
Yeah.
Were very big on instant gratification these days. If I can't afford it now, then it's not fair. And I'm going to say, well, get an evening job, put the money from that into a savings account, and maybe one day you'll get to achieve your goal. Or people have suggested, and in fact one of my sons suggested when I first took them to Rwanda to meet the gorillas, they seem to think, well, it's very unfair that it costs so much to go. They should have a lottery in the gorilla countries so that children can give a few pennies or francs or whatever the currency is and have a chance of visiting the gorillas. But
that's
not
a great idea.
Because the children are not allowed to visit gorillas because the risk of potentially introducing childhood diseases into the gorilla population. So you have to wait until your children are 16 or 18, as mine were, when they first went to see the gorillas, because you want to avoid that health risk to the gorillas or the chimpanzees or other close relatives of ours that people might want to visit. But there are ways around that. But in terms of funding conservation, what I hope will become the new stream of finance that will support conservation is payment for ecosystem services. Because talking about what elephants do to enhance the forest's ability to put water vapor into the atmosphere or sequester and store carbon or other services that forests provide to people, it's all considered, it's natural, it's free.
Yeah. Well, I came up with the concept pay to breathe. We pay for our food, we pay for our water, but we take it totally for granted, the air that we breathe. And what we're talking about is how that, where that oxygen comes from, how that carbon's sequestered, the journey that it takes. And there's an amazing video I just saw the other day with how water travels around the world. And you can really, really clearly see where the forests are is where the water travels. And, where there's desert, there ain't nothing happening. And, it's like, well, how can we make it the new norm that everybody could also, for their daily breath, put in a few pennies or a few pounds and make that as a normal thing that, yes, we pay and that money goes into conservation?
Yes, well, there are lots of potential pitfalls in that statement, because to be effective at scale, we're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of money. And when you start talking about schemes that involve billions of dollars, it tends to attract people who are really interested in billions of dollars and not so much measuring the impact of those dollars.
But what about if it was on a tax on your income?
Well, I think people are not happy with the income tax they have to pay anyway. And
no, but then if you had a conservation, if we had a conservation tax that we literally, if we don't have much, we're giving, a few pennies for our breath. And if we are, a multi-billionaire, then we give a lot more. But if it can be worked out in some way.
My hope is that it can become a part of the global economy.
Yes.
And that just as when you buy a product, whether it's a loaf of bread or a bottle of wine or a laptop, like we're speaking of a laptop, the price is worked out by the company that makes the product, and they include in that price payment of their workers, payment of the plumber who fixes the loo in the staff canteen, payment for the accountants, payment for the raw materials. It's all wrapped into the price, but there isn't at the moment any payment considered for the ecosystem services that make all that happen. So it's like we're not paying for the foundation of all this economic activity to such an extent that I didn't study economics at school. I wasn't interested in it. But I'm now told that in traditional economics, nature is considered an externality. You have the economy that we clever humans have invented, and nature isn't part of it. It only becomes part of it when you destroy it. So you cut down the tree, suddenly that tree is worth money. You kill the elephant, suddenly that elephant is worth money because the front teeth can be sold, or the meat can be sold, or the skin can be sold. But while it's alive, its value is zero unless a tourist comes to see it. But if you're a forest elephant, you live in Central Africa, very few tourists get into the forests in Central Africa. There are civil wars, there's mud, there's very few roads and very few hotels. So it's only really adventurous people that get to see forest elephants in the wild. And yet those elephants every day are working in an ecosystem that sustains us all. And it's getting over that particular hump. And there are far fewer of them today than there were 100 years ago. And there are far more of us, depending on the ecosystem services, than there were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So we have to really explain to people, look, yes, elephants are cute and appealing when they're babies, and they're big and impressive when they're adults, and they have big brains, you know, elephant brain about 3.5, 4 times the size of a human brain. They live for a similar period of time to humans. They have grandparents and grandchildren and hand-on traditions and knowledge, not just to the next generation, but to the one after. And that puts them in a very special class of organisms where grandparenting is a part of their society. Humans and the other apes, elephants, whales and dolphins all have big brains, long lives, and the ability to pass on traditions, which is fascinating. And there's only one international organization that is looking at the importance of animal culture in conservation. That's the Convention on Migratory Species, for which I serve as an ambassador. So I'm very excited that they're looking at the importance of cultural knowledge passed on from generation to generation, sometimes skipping a generation in the long-lived animals, and how we devise conservation strategies to accommodate that, because particularly in the changing world that we are creating with our impact on biodiversity and climate, it may be that animals are only going to survive because they have a bit of cultural knowledge that they learned from their grandparents. And if their grandparent was killed for his or her tusks 20 years ago, when that crisis hits, where are the elders? Where's the pool of knowledge that allows this community of elephants or of gorillas or of chimpanzees or whales or dolphins to survive? So that's an interesting additional factor, but many of the measures that we might take to protect these animals cost money, and the communities that live in or around their habitat are often among the poorest on the planet and the least politically empowered. So what we're trying to do with an initiative called Rebalance Earth, and that's the website, rebalance.earth, is to use blockchain so that companies that want to balance their footprint on nature, not just carbon, but the whole ecosystem footprint, can invest in nature, and using blockchain, that money can go to the community that lives alongside this forest elephant, who is known by name. So we're not just talking about, oh, we think there's about 1,000 plus or minus 20%. No, if each elephant is doing work that can be valued over the course of their life at $2 million or more, because of the effect they have on enhancing the forest services, then the money for those, the payment for those services, can go direct to the communities. And of course, the government will take their cut, and the partners in implementing it. But it's the communities who decide, well, what we really need is actually a new corn mill to grind the corn, or a new clinic so that our kids are better looked after, or a new school, whatever they feel they need. Instead of the money coming from foreign governments in aid, it would come from the services that community help to provide to the world through their ecosystem. And you know, if you go through a developing country, you see a school being built and there's a big sign saying this is a gift from the people of the European Union or the United States of America or from China. But we want signs that say this is a gift from your elephants or your spider monkeys who enhance the forest services and the world now values while it's alive. Don't cut it down, because then it's stopped being valuable in those senses. There might be some carefully controlled timber exploitation because people do love wood and it's a wonderful building material and it stores carbon for centuries. So there's nothing wrong with a carefully controlled use of a forest. But if you're converting forests to something else, and especially if it's to grow taro so that vegans don't have to eat animals, that is misguided. And the best thing about people being misguided is that you can guide them. You can say, actually, I can see where you're going with that. You want animals to suffer less. I want animals to suffer less too. But if you only eat products from big factories grown in plantations that are replacing natural ecosystems, it's not solving the bigger problems. And that's a really important part of the thinking behind anyone's decision to eat less meat. That's probably a good idea. But depending entirely on processed food from industrial agriculture, probably not a good idea for the planet, and probably not for your personal health too, because of all the additives in that food. So it ain't easy to pick a way through all these issues, but they are all connected. And I think there is a way of perhaps managing our planet better, insofar as humans feel it's our right to manage the planet. Very often it's a case of getting humans to stop managing it, just step back and let natural processes that have evolved over billions of years resume without human interference.
Well, I have a good example of that very close to where I live with the NEP Rewilding project, and seeing where they've literally just sat on their hands and not done anything apart from take all the fences down and, let, varying creatures, whether that be, pig or longhorn cattle or wild ponies, run together and let them be the ecosystem engineers and see what comes from it. And it has been absolutely amazing to see what's happened. And locally, nightingales are coming over to where I am. We've got storks flying back over. There's, just seeing how this place has shown an example. And of course, it's very controversial locally as well. A lot of farmers really don't like it, even though what we can see what's happening for the wildlife. And that is when we bring it round to, well, what can one person do? What can an individual do? I mean, we just even encourage people, if you've got a backyard, leave a little bit of it wild. We're so into tidying, and we're still very much into kind of like managing our gardens. And that is really one of the problems. People don't like brambles, even though, and nettles, that in the UK, brambles and nettles are two of the most important food crops for many, many species. But because including
as someone who very much likes blackberries on my
and nettle soup.
And nettle soup, yes.
So I think that's really kind of bringing it back home as well, and saying on a local level.
I still haven't been to NEP yet.
Oh well,
we've got to arrange that.
Yes.
But, the bit I liked about the story was that the thistles and brambles, which people don't like, it in effect deterred the herbivores, so that the slower growing trees could take root and emerge. And once they had a bit of a canopy, then those prickly plants died back. So
we were also saying, let's not call them thistles, because people have a kind of aversion to thistles. Instead, we call them painted lady butterfly flowers. And it's shifting the way that we think about something which traditionally we didn't like. It was messy. Is like, actually, this serves a massive part, a role to play. I've been cultivating land where I live, a huge area of brambles, because I know that is what nightingales want. They want huge areas of brambles. And that's one of the reasons also for their habitat loss, of people just clearing out all the brambles, and they need dense thickets. So, as we kind of understand also what it is that they need, and a lot of what they need is just us to leave the land alone. So to give, hold to those that live there. So have you got any other what would you say one person can do? What are the solutions that we really need to be focusing on right now?
I like to remind people of the 3 Ps that they have, because people are very powerful. Often they think, well, I'm just me and I can't do anything. But you have the power of your purse or pocket, because you can choose to buy a product. And these days, you can tell a company using social media why you're not buying that product. So if you put out a tweet saying, well, I fancied buying this, but I can't find any evidence that this is raw materials are from a sustainable source, whether it's a piece of electronic equipment, because minerals come often from underneath important habitats. And if we're buying something and not checking, then we might be funding the destruction of a habitat that we would not want to fund that destruction. So, and again, use social media to say, I was going to buy this, but I need proof that you're getting your raw materials from a sustainable and ethical source. So being an ethical shopper, yes, FSC timber, certified sustainable palm oil, which has to be no recent deforestation. Obviously, palm oil is growing where it used to be rainforest, but you're trying to prevent new deforestation. And now I know about taro. I didn't know about that before, but that's another disturbing crop. So the power of your pocket, first P. Second P, your political power. Even if you're not old enough to vote, your local elected representative knows that you will be soon. And writing to your MP, finding out who it is that represents your views and making sure that they know your views, because if they don't, how can they represent them? So your power of your purse or pocket, your political power, and your personal power, because you can volunteer for an organization that is working to protect habitat, whether it's down the road in the local bramble patch or on the other side of the planet, helping protect rainforests or coral reefs. And if you have the time, you can hitchhike to a far off destination and enjoy the journey, making every vehicle you get into more efficient in terms of its carrying power, because there's an extra person riding. It used to be, people say freeloading is a negative term, but in fact, if you're freeloading on a vehicle that is burning fossil fuels, or even if you're not, then you make that vehicle more efficient. So, and you provide a service to the driver, conversation, long journeys. It's nice to have someone to talk to. So encourage the resumption of hitchhiking, and in arriving at your destination, offering to help on a project that interests you. And again, these days with social media, you can find out who it is that's running the project, drop them a line. The fact that it's so easy means that they probably get a lot of those lines. So actually turning up and knocking on the door saying, I'm around, do you need an extra pair of hands? These are my skills. You're probably more likely to get some experience that might then lead on to paid employment. But what I don't want everyone to do is to stop doing what they're doing and become a conservationist. We want accountants to be conservationists. We want builders to be conservationists. It needs to permeate the whole of society, this awareness of the impact we're having as individuals and as our organizations. And if you work for the council, make sure the council procurement officer is really up to speed on ethical procurement. If you don't work for the council, but you pay taxes to the council, your taxes are buying stuff.
Yeah. It's
and
vital. And I think that is where ethical consumer, the magazine, the website, it's so critical for us to be able to inform, who do you invest with? Who do you divest from? I mean, that's, it's a major driver of change is our investments and our banks and what, how we use our money. We don't even know how it's being used. If you've got, your money in a high street bank, you can pretty much be sure that investment is not going where you'd want it to. But local conservation groups, I mean, I've been working with a few local conservation groups and they're always desperate for help. And we've got a great little a win here on the South Downs. There were 5 Duke of Burgundy butterflies left. And there's been a conservation project to get the brambles out of the chalklands and clean it up so they can get more cowslips in and more what they like. And now there's actually a few hundred up there. And that really has been from people actually going in and, working with what the butterfly needs to keep it here. It would be gone. It would have become extinct by this year if it hadn't been for this little conservation group actually, working up there on the South Downs. So, we've got to remember.
On Rodborough Common, we've got the similar story with the Adonis Blue.
Yeah. So I think that we must not underestimate our own powers. But what is not going to change is apathy and thinking that somebody else is going to fix the problem. I'm just one person. I can't really do anything. It's big business. It's government. It's corporates. It's them that's got to change. And I think we have to remember that, as you've just said, it's like we have the power to make those decisions and use our hands for good. Get out there and do something, anything, to be a part of the change that we wish to see. So thank you, Ian, for coming along and chatting. And yeah, well, come down to the Net Rewilding project, and it'd be lovely to see you here.
Would love to. Yes, we'll make that happen.
And I will put your link to the virtual tourism and more about Ian on the end of this podcast and video.
Okay, yes, we didn't get into the virtual ecotourism, but that was an experiment which is still live and online, but it hasn't been updated recently. But I think it has a lot of potential. Whether you want to spend your spare time in a VR headset like this, experiencing distant habitats, I like to say at the end of a virtual tour, now take that bloody thing off and go outside and experience nature with all your senses. But certainly you can learn a lot using virtual travel, and the technology to achieve that is getting better and better. So what you will see if you go to vicotourism.org is our efforts a few years ago. And as you know, technology has come forward in leaps and bounds since then. But it's still fun, and you can still visit gorillas or orangutans or elephants and learn about them.
And you can even go and see the elephants that live underground in caves. But we won't say anything more. So you can go and find out about the elephants that go searching for salt down into caves. So thank you again, Ian. And we could talk for hours. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And until the next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.